So in the first kind of part that we did on stress management, we kind of used it as a bit more of an introduction, kind of considering, why it's important, kind of the effects that it can have if left unmanaged. And we kind of looked at more of kind of lifestyle factors and how we can kind of manage that in our habits to already start kind of managing stress much better.
Mhm.
But there are certainly many other things we could actually do to help manage stress. And two very kind of key kind of contributors to this are our training and nutrition. Obviously, last time we already kind of started touching on the idea of the autonomic nervous system and kind of parasympathetic states. And I think, Ben, you probably want to kind of lead off with kind of training when kind of looking at that.
Yeah, so as a reminder, you have the autonomic nervous system and you have the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous system. Sympathetic being fight or flight, parasympathetic being rest and digest. So, as you can guess, for stress management, you want to be in that rest and digest state the majority of the time. So we've talked about lifestyle factors and how they can help with stress management, but let's look now at trend factors. To start, let's look at every powerlifter's favorite word, which is cardio. So, so cardio actually is very good for stress management because cardio obviously helps to build your aerobic capacity, which is basically, it is essentially your cardiovascular conditioning. But your aerobic or the aerobic pathway is also the recovery pathway. So if you have better aerobic capacity, you have a better capacity to recover. If you can, as a side note here, if you can recover better, you have a better ability to manage harder training, essentially. And again, training is a stress itself. So you basically have a better ability to manage more stress.
Yeah, great.
So looking at this from, say, like your heart rate perspective. Now, if your heart rate is elevated, again, this is a signal to your body to be in this fight or flight sympathetic nervous system. So if you have a higher resting heart rate, and say you're going to sleep at night, in the middle of the night, you've got a resting heart rate of like 90 or something like that. That's very high for when you're asleep. That is very high when you're asleep. Now, that number one, that suggests you have poor cardiovascular conditioning. But in terms of like this signal, it's telling your body that, whilst you're meant to be asleep and recovering, the ultimate recovery, which is sleep, it's telling your body that it's supposed to be like fighting a lion or something. That's the signal you're giving to your body that you're in this fight or flight state when you're trying to be asleep, which again is this ultimate recovery state. So if we can improve cardiovascular conditioning, number one, we can lower resting heart rate, which directly sends a signal to be in a rest and digest state. And we can also, like I say, improve this aerobic capacity, which means we have greater recovery I've got the word recovery capabilities. As you can see, I have mind blips all the time. Whatever. So recovery capabilities, which means a greater ability to manage stress. So number one, straight off the bat, is do your cardio. Listen again, do your cardio. Don't miss out on cardiovascular work.
I'd better heed that information. Yeah.
It is important. So that's the cardio aspect. Again, I don't know if you want to add anything before we move on to more of the other training factors we've got to account for.
And I keep rolling with it. I've got some ideas I kind of want to get across a little more on the resistance training side of things, and kind of some ideas on arousal and stuff like that. So I reckon if you want to kind of go into training things already, then I'll just add on after you've kind of touched on that.
So resistance training, that, as we've touched on, is a stress. Mm-hmm. That's so important to remember. Again, stress plus recovery equals adaptation. So that stress is a good stress. It is a good stress. But refer back to the first episode. Stress is stress. Too much stress is bad. Stress adds up, it accumulates, it compounds, and you get a total stress load. So yes, your training has to be looked at as a stress and considered with all the other stresses in your life. So if you're a highly stressed individual, you should not be doing super hard training, because the harder you train, the greater the stress. That adds to this total stress load, and it makes this problem worse. So your training has to be looked at in that way. Again, if you don't, for whatever reason, don't care about your health that much, then, and you just care about growing muscle, then guess what? If you're highly stressed and your training is a stress and it adds to the stress load, performance is not going to be very good anyway. So even if you just care about gaining muscle, you're not really going to perform very well, which means the result of gaining muscle is not really going to go your way. So even if you just care about that front, then viewing training as a stress is still relevant to you and still important to you. So yes, you have to view stress as training, and then you have to take that into consideration, your actual lifestyle and how stressed you are as a person when it comes to writing and performing a training plan. So resistance training is great, and it can help with stress management itself. But unlike cardio, like I say, it does place a huge stress or toll onto the body. So from a purely training perspective, we'll touch on like how their nutrition starts to interact in a bit. But from a training perspective, if you are someone that is highly stressed, so you're not, like I say, you're not going to want to train super, super hard. And this is where we can now look at training in a periodized way. So what I mean by that is if you're highly stressed, you probably, as we've touched on, want to, in terms of training, place a focus onto your cardiovascular work first. So maybe you only want to train a couple times a week, so twice a week, and then your whole training block is focused around cardio. So you're improving that side of things first. You're improving your stress management on that side of things. You're improving your recovery capabilities on that side of things. It's all going to lead into this ability to be able to train harder down the road. So again, it's this ability to think long term. In terms of the training twice a week, you probably just want to do enough to help maintain your current muscle mass. So full body twice a week, nothing too hard. Maybe you want to look at maybe doing systemic work, because again, that's just going to further help conditioning. But that's then when you have to then start to consider your nutrition around that. But again, before we touch on the nutrition, I know you want to add some things first, Kev, so I'll let you do that first, and then we'll start to talk about matching your nutrition to training.
Yeah, no, I think that was good. I think that there's a lot for people to kind of consider on the idea of, training being a stressor in itself, and therefore also kind of how we can kind of, as you mentioned, kind of periodize things potentially around periods of higher stress to ensure that we're not just kind of adding to that stress and making it even more unmanageable. Because again, a lot of people do think of training kind of more as a stress management tool, but if we're not using that in the right way, then we're potentially actually just kind of hindering our ability to progress by actually just making this problem even worse. And that kind of links into what I wanted to kind of add on to there about kind of the psychology, especially when we get into kind of our style of training, which is why I think people would be should be particularly vigilant about how kind of stress affects that. Because, especially when we're looking at kind of more hardcore training, it becomes very kind of, it's become very kind of popular to kind of, take it there before you're set, so you can kind of give things like, max effort. But going back to the idea of kind of the autonomic nervous system and kind of sympathetic versus parasympathetic state, then obviously usually when we're training, because we're exposing ourselves to these stresses, usually that's going to be obviously sympathetic leaning anyway. And usually that's why it's important to focus on, getting into more of a parasympathetic state post-training, so that we can, be in a better position to kind of potentially sleep if we're training like after work or something, and obviously be able to eat and digest our meals more efficiently post-training. This then comes with the whole idea of kind of the psychology and arousal side of things, because if we are kind of taking it there before a set and trying to really kind of stimulate ourselves to get into this state of more extreme arousal for the sake of performance benefit, then again, going along with the idea of potentially training a little less harder during periods of stress and maybe a bit more kind of just maintenance work, again also comes this idea of, if we're really kind of driving ourselves further and further into a sympathetic state, especially when we consider kind of more psychological arousal, are we just contributing further to the problem? And again, can we actually just take a little bit of a step back on training to maybe make 2 steps forward when thinking a little more long term? With those things kind of considered, and kind of training in itself being a stressor, as well as kind of the psychological impacts. Obviously, with that being said, there is kind of the idea of potentially, if you can learn to kind of let those demons loose in training, then can you potentially better manage them at other times of the day? Potentially, but it's worth considering.
Right.
if that is actually, you know, doing a bit more harm than good, and potentially if you do kind of fit more into one side of that or the other, and how you individually manage your stress best. But,
so rabbit hole time. We have to jump down this rabbit hole now that you've brought it up. First thing I'll say before I jump down the rabbit hole is, in terms of like arousal states, quick point out is, in psychology you have something called inverted U theory, which is basically looking at different states of arousal. So it's literally like that, it's a bell-shaped curve. Here you're not very aroused at all, so it's bottom. Here optimal arousal, and here you're overly aroused. You want to be in that level of optimal arousal to be able to perform best, because if you're overly aroused or under aroused, you won't perform well. Second thing is the demon side of things. We need to jump down this rabbit hole because this probably will impact a lot more people. So if you use your demons to help you train, now there's a difference between just getting yourself hyped up and aroused and maybe a bit angry versus using an emotional demon response. So if you use your demons to be able to train hard and you progress in a set, it feels good to progress, right? When you hit a PR, it feels good. So what does that do? Well, it creates a sense of reward. You've progressed, you feel good about yourself, you've created a sense of reward. Your body obviously, likes that feeling of, it's because it's a feeling of pleasure. Your body likes a feeling of pleasure. Well, if you now start to associate these demons with a feeling of pleasure and this dopamine release, guess how your body is now going to start to get this dopamine release? Because you need more every time. If you over abuse dopamine release, then you need more to stimulate the pleasure response in the first place. So the way in which your mind is now going to start to seek that pleasure is by essentially upregulating those feelings that comes with the whole, the using your demon side of things. So you're actually creating more stress in that sense, more emotional trauma by upregulating that trauma, because your mind is associating it with those feelings of pleasure. And so using those demons to train hard, yes, it might help you with your training, it might help you to progress, but it's also reinforcing that trauma. And again, emotional trauma is probably one of the biggest stresses you could ever have in your life, like undoubtedly. So understanding that is actually really important. And there is a difference, like say, between getting yourself aroused and maybe getting even a bit angry and working hard in a set versus using emotional trauma, essentially. And that's just, again, that's a rabbit hole, but it's one we need to jump down so people can understand, and they can understand why outside the gym they're having more anxiety or depression or problems is because they're reinforcing that emotional trauma through what they're doing in the gym. And that's just really, really key and important to understand. So again, that does affect stress management. All right, so rabbit hole, jump down. Let's jump back out now. Let's look at training side of things. Nutrition and training side of things, yes. So matching your nutrition to your training is also incredibly important for stress management. So again, looking at something like, and this is very typical, especially for females in the gym, is they do more sort of metabolic style work, which is again just that lactic acid buildup, that feel the burn sort of style of training. But what do girls also do at the same time? Well, no carbs before marbs.
No carbs.
No carbs before marbs, right? That's very popular saying. So it's just like work relentlessly hard in the gym and eat no carbs. Well, guess what? This metabolic style of training, this lactic acid buildup style of training, requires a lot of glucose to be to do, basically. It's a glucose dominant fuel system. So if you're not providing your body with the glucose it needs to be able to do that, guess what? That's creating huge amounts of stress onto the body because it doesn't have the fuel source it needs. So matching your nutrition to your training in that sense is, again, it's paramount. It's so important for stress management. Otherwise, again, you're just creating loads more stress. So again, that's really, really critical. I'll throw that back to you now, Kev.
Yeah, I think that's a very good one to throw out, particularly at times like this where it's relevant, because I mean, we probably won't release this for a few weeks, but obviously I think as gyms start to open up, obviously now with us kind of in the final few weeks of lockdown before gyms open up, I think there's a lot that people are going to carry forward from their lockdown training to the gyms. And I think obviously that's a very good one to touch on, because I think that's something that's become even more increasingly popular during lockdown, both this idea of more kind of metabolic style work and kind of the restriction of carbs, because a lot of people have kind of associated lockdown with being much more sedentary, and therefore, oh, well, we're not moving as much, we're not being as active, we don't need kind of as many carbs. But as you rightly touched on there, kind of this more metabolic style work is obviously very glucose demanding. So to actually consider, those kind of nutritional protocols and not really matching it up with the kind of training that you're doing is potentially a lot more detrimental. And I think people kind of potentially, now with gyms opening back up soon, will potentially kind of, with lessons that they've learned through training during lockdown, and as we kind of touched on in the efficient lockdown training episode that we did, is a lot of people who maybe have been looking to get a bit more active through lockdown and kind of potentially ingrained in themselves these, dare I say it, bad habits from kind of potential, taking workouts from these influencers and workouts which are much more kind of sensation based and feel the burn. They might take these forward to the gyms with them and then, potentially work themselves even harder as they kind of have more opportunity to do so. And we get into this idea of kind of further, creating unnecessary amounts of stress by then not really matching our nutrition with our training. So I think that was a very good one to kind of throw out there. Obviously, carbohydrates are important for kind of a variety of energy systems. So they are very associated with kind of training heavier and requiring shorter bursts of energy. But I don't think a lot of people realize that potentially, even though again, looking at lockdown, maybe other kind of parts of our life we may be, less active in, these kind of, styles of training are still very glucose demanding. So we should be placing a decent priority on kind of matching our nutrition to our training.
Yeah, I'm just going to pause the video because okay, I'm recording again.
So yeah, hopefully that kind of gives people something to think about in regards to kind of matching their nutrition to their training. But there are also kind of other ways we can kind of look at nutrition in terms of its impact on stress as a whole. I know you've got some kind of cool things you want to kind of cover on carbohydrates and kind of fructose and stuff like that. So I'll hand it over back to you.
Yes. So nutrition and sleep. Let's look at that, okay, in terms of stress management. Now, obviously, we've already covered the fact that sleep is very, very important for stress management, both on a physiological and psychological, or from a physiological and psychological standpoint. So we want good sleep. We know we want good sleep. So nutrition, how can nutrition affect sleep, essentially? So again, let's stay with carbs because we've talked about carbs already, and carbs are wonderful and you should eat carbs. So let's talk about carbs. So in terms of sleep, one of the best things you can do for good quality sleep and to make sure you stay asleep, which is really, really key for sleep quality, is making sure we have a regulated blood glucose levels throughout the night. Because if they dip down, guess what? That's a signal to your body that stress is happening. Then you'll wake up. So looking at fruit, we can put in a piece of fruit, around the nighttime. Kiwi is a really good option because it also contains high levels of serotonin, which gets converted to melatonin, which is the antioxidant, which helps you fall and stay asleep. Yep. But looking at fructose in general, fructose helps to feed liver glycogen. And if we ensure we have enough liver glycogen, helps to maintain a stable blood sugar. So that's going to be really, really key for when we're going to sleep. Because if we have make sure we maintain a stable blood sugar throughout the night, means we'll stay asleep and we sort of lose that stress side of things that could potentially happen whilst we're asleep. So again, better sleep quality, which then means better tolerance to stress and better perceived stress as well. So something as simple as putting a serving of fruit, ideally kiwi, doesn't have to be, with your last meal of the day. It's just such a simple nutritional trick you can do to help with sleep quality and therefore stress management.
Hey everyone, thank you very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed. If you did, be sure to like the video, leave a comment and subscribe for more.
If you enjoyed that episode, be sure to check out the latest Fitbit here and the latest podcast here. Thanks for watching, guys and girls.